Bueno. Bueno, ahí está. Muy bien, pues muchas gracias a todos por acompañarnos. Ahora en esta... ¿Ya son finales en la facultad? ¿Ya están en finales? ¿Están en finales? ¿Sí? No, this is final week almost. ¿No, todavía no? Bueno. Están estudiando para sus finales por lo menos. Gracias por acompañarnos. Es un honor y un gusto recibir aquí al doctor Thomas Pogge. Él es profesor de filosofía y de asuntos públicos, una mezcla muy afortunada e interesante ahí en la Universidad de Yale. Y él es un autor muy ilustre, muy conocido y reconocido en estos temas de pensar lo público desde un enfoque ético y filosófico. Realmente es de los líderes internacionales en esta materia. Tiene un libro recién que nos estaba diciendo que ni siquiera es una traducción, es una nueva compilación de sus obras, sus ensayos, que se llama Hacer Justicia a la Humanidad. Y este libro se va a presentar hoy en la tarde, ya ni vi la hora. Alguien tenía ahí en propaganda que a las 7, a las 19 horas, hoy trajo algunas propagandas al mismo doctor Pogge. En el Fondo de Cultura, ahí en la Condesa, ¿verdad? Es el de allá. O sea, a las 7 de la noche va a presentar este libro hoy en la noche. Viene invitado, en primer lugar, por el gobierno de la Ciudad de México. Este lunes y martes participó en un foro de la Semana Nacional de Ciencia y Tecnología de la Ciudad de México, donde habló sobre temas relacionados. Y tenemos el honor y el gusto de recibirlo hoy. Él no habla español. Do you understand Spanish? Can you take questions in Spanish? Or translate this? Entiende un poquito. No pedimos traducción, fíjate, porque luego sale muy caro la traducción y muchas veces no sirve de nada, la verdad. Sobre todo en un discurso así filosófico, profundo, como lo que nos va a compartir Thomas. Entonces, no tenemos traducción. Los que lo requieran, y no sé si hay alguien aquí en el público que quiera, por ejemplo, ofrecerse a sentarse ahí con un grupo para ayudarles con el español. ¿Alguien quiere anotarse? ¿Aquí hay alguien? ¿Sí? ¿Tú le podrías ayudar a algún colega a entender un poco más el inglés? ¿Cómo te llamas? David. Pues David, ¿cómo estás? Mucho gusto. No, David es el traductor y el que hizo este libro, ¿no? Entonces, pues él muy amablemente ofrece, hay alguien aquí que si quisieran acercarse con él les podría ir acompañando quizás con algunos de los términos más complicados, el inglés. ¿Sí? David, si quieres igual acércate por allá, o ¿dónde sería un buen lugar? Muchas gracias, David, perdón, ni habíamos conversado sobre esta posibilidad. Ahí está David. Si alguien quiere, aquí enfrente hay alguien aquí. ¿Hay alguien que quiere el apoyo? ¿No? ¿Sí? Sí. A ver, ¿dónde va a estar David? Ahí está. Bueno, en el transcurso del seminario, si empiezan a perder el hilo, acérquense con David, él va a estar cuchicheando ahí un poco del sentido. Muchas gracias. Bueno, sin más preámbulo, le damos la palabra a Thomas Pogge. I think if possible we could 45 minutes. Because Carla nuestro comentarista Carla Huerta es investigadora muy distinguida, nuestros grandes expertos en materia de filosofía jurídica, teoría jurídica. Ella va a ser comentarista, va a fungir como comentarista de la conferencia unos 15 minutos, 45 minutes, 15 minutes to leave, maybe half an hour to have an exchange and conversation in the end. Las preguntas al final, con mucho gusto, los recibimos en español, se los traducimos, ¿no? Y ojalá genere inquietud y podamos tener una discusión al final. Sí, ahorita le movemos la computadora para que...
Then how is it going to work? Okay.
Good.
Welcome, and sorry that I cannot address you in Spanish. Does this work? Is the microphone working? No.
No, es que no te he entendido.
Okay, is this better? Does this work? Okay. So, very happy to be here. Sorry that I cannot speak to you in Spanish. I would love to, but my Spanish is not good enough. And basically what I will talk about has three parts. The first part is normative about human rights. The second part is descriptive or explanatory about world poverty, which is the biggest human rights problem in the world in my view. And then the third part is about reform, where I want to talk a little bit about the Health Impact Fund, but we can cut that short if we reach the 45 minutes. So I will see how far we get. And you are welcome to a copy of this PowerPoint. I know that some of this information is going by pretty quickly, so if you want to look at it afterwards, you're more than welcome to do so. There are no secrets in this PowerPoint. Okay, so I start with human rights and my institutional conception of human rights. And basically here my main claim is that international law is a schizophrenic entity. It is divided into a Sunday part where you have beautiful declarations, beautiful endorsements of human rights, and a everyday part, the rest of the week, where you have rules that are violating those very same human rights that are being celebrated in conventions and declarations and so on. So there is a split in international law. The very same human rights that are being recognized and celebrated in some parts of international law are also massively violated by other parts of it. Is the speed okay? Yeah. Good. Now, to get to that conclusion, I start from an institutional understanding of human rights. I think that human rights can also be understood as imposing constraints on institutions. That is, the rules that structure the interactions of people. These are constraining and structuring rules that exist on the national level and also on the global level. And these sorts of rules can also be assessed in terms of human rights. And you see here Article 28 in the Universal Declaration, which already in 1948 made that same point. So it says that everyone is entitled to a social and international order in which the rights and freedoms set forth in this declaration can be fully realized. Many people overlook this article because they think that it just adds another right after many other rights have already been stated. But this article really does not introduce a new right. It merely says something about how all these rights should be interpreted, namely not only as constraints on the conduct of individual and collective agents, but also as constraints on the rules that it is permissible to impose on such agents. So human rights can be violated not only by individuals and collectives such as governments, but they can also be violated by rules, or better maybe through rules. Now, when is an institutional order a system of rules non-compliant with human rights? I propose that we make that depend on four conditions. All these four conditions have to be fulfilled. So there has to be a human rights deficit. That deficit has to be associated with the existing rules, and it must be avoidable. So it must be possible to redesign the rules in such a way that this deficit would disappear or would be much smaller. Thirdly, it must be foreseeable that there is such a deficit. And fourthly, the avoidability of the deficit must also be foreseeable. So if you apply that to Mexico, for example, if we have a high incidence of human rights under fulfillment in Mexico now, and if we could reorganize the institutions of the Mexican state, the basic rules that govern Mexico, in such a way as to greatly reduce that human rights deficit, And if both these things are foreseeable, if it's foreseeable that if we maintain the rules into the future, the high level of human rights under-fulfillment will continue, and if we change the rules in some specific way, that incidence will go down a lot, then maintaining the existing system would be violating human rights. Now, human rights are related, unfortunately often not by authors, but they should be, with human responsibilities. There's a lot of talk about human rights. There's very little talk about human responsibilities. Everybody is happy to talk, about human rights, but not about the responsibilities. Now, I think we can group the responsibilities into three cases. There are cases where under-fulfillment of human rights is unavoidable, at least unavoidable for us, and we are not responsible then for these human rights deficits. There's nothing we can do about it. The clearest case is human rights under-fulfillment in the past. I was born in the 20th century, so there's nothing I can do about what happened in the 18th century. Insofar as I can avert, by undertaking active action, if I can avert human rights deficits, then I have a positive duty perhaps to do so, and these, in the jargon of the United Nations, are called responsibilities to protect and to fulfill human rights. And then there are also responsibilities to respect human rights, and here these are the most serious, the most weighty. We must never act in such a way that as a consequence of what we actively do, human rights are underfulfilled. So by actively causing human rights underfulfillment, we are violating human rights, whereas if we merely don't act to protect human rights or to fulfill human rights, we are merely violating positive duties. That's bad enough, or can be bad enough in many cases, but it's a less severe failing than human rights violations. And it's these violations that I mostly focus on, and the reason for that is that I live in the Anglophone world, and the Anglophone world is characterized by making very significant the distinction between positive and negative duties. So they say that negative duties are much more weighty, much more important than positive duties. Negative duties are duties not to harm. Positive duties are duties to help, to assist, to protect, to fulfill human rights. Now, the case that you are most familiar with is that of interactional human rights violations, and these can be characterized loosely in terms of 5 conditions. There must be unfulfilled human rights. They are causally traceable to human agents. These agents are active in a way that causes the human rights deficit. They act, that's often added, in an official capacity, so people think that if one person just attacks another person on the street, that's not a human rights violation, that's just an ordinary crime. I don't take a stand on that, I don't care. And finally, the causal relationship between the action and the underfulfilled human right must be foreseeable for the agent. The agent must intend or foresee, or at least be in a position to foresee, that her conduct will cause that human rights deficit. And I propose the same thing for the institutional case, where we say that there must be a human rights deficit, in this case a statistical one. It must be causally traceable to social rules, so that you say that if the rules had been different, there would be less of a deficit in terms of human rights. There must be active individual contributions of the purported human rights violators. They must be doing something active, for example, contributing to the design of these institutions or to their imposition, in order to be human rights violators. The rules must have some sort of official character. Again, that's something one could drop. And agents must intend or foresee or be in a position to foresee that what they do causes this human rights deficit, what they together do often in terms of imposing certain rules. Human rights can give you then a minimal conception of justice, both for the national level and the global level. A conception of justice will probably contain a lot of other things besides the fulfillment of human rights, but human rights are minimal conditions that any system of rules has to satisfy in order to count as just. It's not a sufficient condition, but it's at least a necessary condition. And the idea is then that if we don't structure our institutional orders nationally and globally in such a way that human rights are fulfilled insofar as that's reasonably possible, then we are, by imposing a different non-human rights satisfying order on people, guilty of violating their human rights. Now, there is one point that's maybe a little bit difficult, which I should try to explain at least briefly, about the notion of harm. Normally when you think of harm, especially in interactional cases, you think about harm diachronically. You say that I act, and before I acted, this person was well off, and after I acted, this person was worse off. So harm is associated with this idea of time, that I make a person worse off than the person was before, or maybe than the person would have been without my action. But in the institutional case, that's not the right conception of harm. And you can see that, take the example of women voting. Women got the vote in Mexico in 1953, I think, right? So before 1953, women didn't have the right to vote, and I want to say that the institutions of Mexico were harmful to women insofar as they were governed by the law, but they had no opportunity to participate in shaping the law. So that's an injustice, and imposing this injustice on women was doing harm to women. And you see here that the ordinary notion, the diachronic notion, doesn't fit. Women were not worse off than they were before. They were just as badly off before. They never voted before 1953. It was not that the vote was taken away from them. They never had it. And nevertheless, the system was harmful to them, was harming them through this injustice throughout the period until 1953. Similarly with slavery. Slavery in the US in the early 19th century was a harm inflicted on the slaves, even though the slaves were never better off before. So it's that notion of harm that one needs to appeal to. Now, the whole point of the exercise, briefly, is that in the US, as I said, in the Anglophone world, people make a big distinction between negative and positive duties. So they say that actively killing somebody is a terrible thing. But if you can save somebody's life and you don't do it, that's much less serious. And then they say, among the positive duties, helping people, it makes a big difference who you are helping. It's important to help friends and relatives. It's less important to help neighbors and people in your town. It's less important still to help compatriots. And it's least important to help distant foreigners. And so people in the Anglophone world, they put the suffering of distant foreigners at the very bottom of the list. They say, well, yes, millions of people are poor, but this is really the lowest priority category for me, because these are foreigners very far away, and my relationship to them is one of potential helpers. So I could help more, but I don't really have a strong reason to do that. Now, my counter to that is to say, well, sorry, no, it's not just that you're not helping enough, you're also harming a lot. And you're harming a lot because through your governments, you are imposing global institutional structures that foreseeably and avoidably are causing massive human rights deficits to persist in the poor countries. So I move much of the damage from the category of we could help to alleviate that damage to the category of we are causing that damage. And that has two effects. First, it moves from the positive duty into the negative duty category, which is an important move, makes it much more significant morally speaking. And secondly, the distinction between people close to me and people very distant to me has much less importance in the case of negative duties than in the case of positive duties. In the case of negative duties, it would not be easy to say that because this person is a distant stranger, I don't have to pay attention to their interest. So take a person who likes to drink a lot and then drive the car afterwards. And the person says to you, look, I do that, I often drive drunk, and so I endanger people, but I would never do that in my own country. I only do that abroad, where I endanger foreigners. Right? You see here that it doesn't make a big difference. We would think the same about this person if he did this abroad from when he did this here, right? If a Mexican told you this and said, I never do this in Mexico, I only do it in Argentina, you'd say, well, that doesn't improve my judgment of you very much, because you shouldn't harm human beings regardless of whether they are your compatriots or foreigners. So the move is a very important move to say, wait a minute, these are not distant strangers whom you're not helping enough. Yes, they're distant strangers, but you're harming them and in many cases killing them. Good. Now this applies first and foremost in the case of global poverty. Poverty is by far the greatest human rights violation today. It is much, much, much bigger than all the wars and all the other, the torture and so on, all of which are bad and all of which, of course, I oppose. But poverty is just in orders of magnitude larger. This is the human right that you have in the Universal Declaration, number 25. Everybody should have that very minimal standard of living, enough to eat, medicine, basic social services, and so on. And this right is very, very massively underfulfilled. And you can see this here. The kinds of things that the right is calling for, hundreds of millions and even billions of people are still lacking today. So you can see these figures, people who are chronically undernourished, people who lack access to essential medicines, safe drinking water, adequate shelter, electricity, adequate sanitation, literacy, and child labor. So there are enormous deprivations persisting, and you can say that at least 1/3 of all people who die from poverty-related causes. That number is very, very large. Of course, many of these people are children. And I have counted very, very conservatively. So what I count here, when you look at these causes of death every year, 57 million die every year, 18 are poverty-related. I have only counted those people who die from causes that are unknown in the rich countries. Nobody in the rich countries dies of diarrhea. Nobody dies of meningitis or malaria or something like that. If you add to that all the people who die from causes that we in the rich countries also know well, like cancer and diabetes and heart disease, but die much earlier because they get lousy medical care or no medical care at all, then the number would be much higher still. So a very, very large number of people die each year from poverty. And if you add that up, my conservative estimate of 18 million a year, you find that this dwarfs all the catastrophes of war and civil war and gulags and concentration camps in the 20th century. So poverty killed 370 million people in 20 years since the end of the Cold War. And the Second World War killed only, in quotes, 60 million people, and that was the biggest catastrophe of all. Now, I want to say three things about this problem of poverty, namely that most premature deaths and deprivations today are causally traceable to injustice in the existing supranational institutional order, for which the more powerful countries and their citizens are responsible, and then, of course, in violation of a negative duty of justice. So we, citizens of the rich countries, are massively violating human rights by imposing global institutional arrangements, a global institutional structure that foreseeably and avoidably is causing these massive human rights deficits. Now, when you say that in the West, you always get this counter-argument. It's so popular that The Economist magazine has it almost every week in one form or another. And the argument is, this can't be right. And it can't be right because poverty develops very differently in different countries. So in Senegal, for example, Senegal was very poor in the 1950s and it's still poor. Korea was very poor in the 1950s and it's rich now. So it can't be the global order that is causing poverty to persist. It must be national factors, local factors. And so this argument convinces everybody, and so I want to quickly show you how it's a non sequitur. One friend of this argument, by the way, is John Rawls, who was my supervisor of my thesis. He repeats that argument, but never mind. So I give you two arguments against it. One argument is conceptual. It's just to show that this is a non sequitur. The other argument is empirical, and to give you some examples. So the conceptual argument goes by analogy. So I come from a university that's called Yale University. And Yale is different from UNAM because at the end of the semester there are great differences in how the students perform. So at UNAM everybody does very well, but at Yale some students do very poorly at the end. So some learn a lot, some learn very little. And so we can conclude from that the quality of the teacher is irrelevant to the learning success of the students, right? Because there are big differences in student performance, it can't be the teacher, right? Well, not exactly right. It would be very silly to say that. Of course the teacher can make a difference. The teacher can make a difference in three different ways. First, if the teacher were better or worse, the whole class would do better or worse. Second, the teacher selects certain teaching materials and a certain teaching style, and that may be more appropriate for some students and less appropriate for others. And so maybe even the inequalities in performance are due to the selection of the teaching materials, the teaching style, and so on. Thirdly, even the student-specific factors that are important, for example, motivation, the motivation of each individual student, even that can be influenced very profoundly by the teacher. So imagine a teacher who's a sexist and always makes dumb jokes about women and they shouldn't really be at university and so on. Now some women will maybe take that seriously and they will lose confidence and they'll say, well, maybe I should find a husband and go to the kitchen. And other women will say, well, this guy is such an idiot, such a dinosaur, you know. Why should I listen to this guy at all about anything, right? If he's that stupid about women, then he cannot possibly teach me anything about anything else. So the women, let's say, perform worse in the class than the men. Now, the reason for this is not anything about the women, about the students, but the ultimate reason is, again, the global factor, the teacher. So the argument, no matter how often the Economist magazine repeats it, is just a non sequitur. It doesn't follow. You have differences in performance, and it could still be that the global order is very relevant. So let me give examples of that. Basically, there are several examples, and they are very analogous to the example I just gave of the teacher. So there are some things that work directly against human rights fulfillment. So we have rules of trade and finance. You know there is a lot of protectionism still going on. The rich countries are, despite all this talk about free markets and so on, they're protecting their markets with quotas, with tariffs, with anti-dumping duties, with export credits to domestic companies, and huge subsidies, especially in agriculture, which allow cotton from the United States and sugar from Europe to flood world markets and thereby displacing products from poor countries, which of course cannot afford to subsidize their exports. Environmental laws. Well, you know, we are polluting. We are responsible for most of the pollution in the world. Most of the harm from that pollution goes to the poor, and we don't have to pay for it. That could be different. There could be different rules which would force us to pay for some of the damage that we do in poor countries through our pollution. Some rules work against human rights indirectly. This is the case of the sexist teacher. And, for example, there are these international resource borrowing treaty and arms privileges, where we basically say that any person or group that takes power in a country and is somehow controlling that country, imposing its power on that country, is viewed as entitled to sell the natural resources of the people, to borrow money in the name of the people, to sign treaties in the name of the people, and to import weapons in the name of the people, regardless of whether these people were elected or took power by force, and regardless of how badly they rule. So all these guys like Sani Abacha and Mobutu Sese Seko and Suharto and all the dictators of the developing world are sustained and supported and incentivized by this rule, which says, if you manage somehow to bring a country under your control, then we will recognize you as the legitimate government of that country, and you are the one who will be paid for the oil, for the minerals, for the resources. You are the one who will be recognized as entitled to put repayment obligations on the people by borrowing a lot of money, and so on. Many poor countries have huge debts, and these debts come from earlier people who were not elected. These were people who just took power by force, and then sooner or later they die or disappear, and then the country has to repay the enormous debts that these people accumulated. Okay, intellectual property rights I'll talk about a little bit later if I can fit it into my 45 minutes. And illicit financial flows, that's something we are now working on. You know that the rich countries are giving $120 billion in development aid, but they also get more than 10 times as much in illicit money coming out. And that's money that's often embezzled and is then parked in Western bank accounts, but much of it is also money that comes through trade mispricing. Trade mispricing is a very nice trick where a company, let's say the company produces in India and sells in South Africa. Now, instead of shipping the stuff directly to South Africa, they first sell it to their subsidiary in the Cayman Islands, and that subsidiary then sells it to South Africa. Why do they do that? Well, they sell from India to the Cayman Islands at a very low price, and so there is no profit in India. Then they sell from the Cayman Islands to South Africa at a very high price, so sorry, there's no profit in South Africa. All the profit of the company is in the Cayman Islands, and the goods never go there. The goods travel directly from India to South Africa. So why is all the profit in the Cayman Islands? Because there the tax rate is the lowest. And so the company pays no taxes in India because it has no profit there. It pays no taxes in South Africa because it has no profit there. It pays all its taxes in the Cayman Islands where the rate is very, very low. So they have huge profits, very low taxes, and the two countries in which the company does business, both of them get nothing. Okay, so this is then the overarching picture. We have on the right bottom what we want to explain. Why is it happening that poverty persists at such an enormous level? We explain that through failures in national institutions and failures in global institutions, where often the failures in national institutions are caused by failures in global institutions. For example, the international resource privilege, borrowing privilege, and so on. That's again the sexist teacher, where there is a motivational deficit among the women. Yes, they are not motivated, but the reason for that deficit is the sexism of the teacher. And so the global institutional order bears a very large responsibility, which in turn then devolves upon the governments of the more powerful countries and ultimately the citizens and corporations of those countries. So what we have then, I think, is a very nasty situation, namely a situation where globalization has pushed rules from the national level up to the global level. So more and more of the rules that govern the interactions among individuals and corporations and other organizations, more and more of these rules are now supranational rules. Supranational rules become more and more important, and these rules are negotiated by governments and their delegates in ways that are very intransparent and certainly totally undemocratic. So very few people, not you and not me, can influence these negotiations. They're very difficult to influence, and there's only a very small group of elite agents who can influence the most powerful governments and thereby indirectly influence the rule-making at the global level. And these are, of course, the very most powerful corporations, very rich, influential agents, very few of them, who can act more or less unopposed. If they agree on something among themselves, they can normally twist the arms of the US government, the European government, and get the rules that they want. Now, what rules do they want? They want the rules that make them even richer. They want rules from which they themselves benefit. And so we have a vicious spiral. As these agents manage to influence the rules at the supranational level, they become richer. And as they become richer, they have more of an ability to influence the rules. So you can see that here when you look at the distribution of income in the world. This is global household income, and it completely ignores national borders. So this is all the human beings in the world. How much income do the various groups have? You know what ventiles are, right? The top 5% is the top ventile. The richest ventile, 5% of the world's population, they have 46.36% of global household income. And as you go lower, you get much, much lower rates. So the top ventile has 9 times the average income in the world, and the bottom quarter has 1/32 of the average income in the world. So the ratio is 300 to 1 between the top ventile and the bottom quarter, And more importantly, look at the red numbers on the right-hand side. Who is gaining over time and who is losing? There's only one ventile that has a meaningful gain, that is growing its share of global household income, and that's the top ventile. The other 19 ventiles, they are not growing, they're shrinking. So one ventile is growing at the expense of all the others, and who is losing the most? Well, the bottom quarter. The bottom quarter in 17 years has lost 1/3 of its share. Now, of course, they benefit from the pizza getting larger, but they are hurt by the fact that the slice gets thinner and thinner, and very dramatically so, as that picture shows. I will leave this out. And this is a last slide on the economics of it, just to show you that poverty today is not unavoidable. So here you take, these are the pictures, the numbers from the World Bank. The World Bank has an official poverty line of $1.25, purchasing power parity, which means it's converted into other currencies, taking prices into account, price differences into account. So the World Bank, with its poverty line, counts 1.38 billion poor people, and these people live 30% below their official poverty line. And still, the entire deficit of all these people is only 0.17% of the world income, or $76 billion. $76 billion is what all these poor people collectively are missing to reach their poverty line of $1.25. $76 billion is 1/9 of the U.S. military budget. So it's a very small amount of money. If you are more ambitious than the World Bank's poverty line is ridiculously low. But if you are more ambitious, double that poverty line to $2.50, and you find that there are more than 3 billion people who are poor, and that they on average live 45% below the poverty line. And still, the total deficit is only $500 billion, or 1.13% of world income, or 2/3 of the U.S. military budget. So if anybody tells you the poverty problem is very big, then they're right about the human magnitude of the problem, but they're totally wrong about the economic magnitude of the problem. World poverty in economic terms is very small. And if we made small changes in the global institutional architecture, we would, at pretty low opportunity cost for the rich, achieve massive reductions in poverty for the poor. Now, a path to reform. I've got about 10 more minutes, 8 or 9, something like that. So I want to talk briefly about reform. The problem here is this. The world is extremely unjust. So tens of millions of people are dying from poverty-related causes. Billions are suffering insecurity and humiliation and daily worry about survival in a way that is totally unnecessary. So in a world that is so extremely unjust, it is not so difficult to find reforms. It's not difficult to find ways of making things better. But the problem is that we have to unite. We cannot have 10,000 good ideas for reform. We have to unite behind particular reforms and push them through, and then maybe go to the next one. So we have to agree on a program of reform that unites our political efforts, both in the rich countries and in the poor countries, to make real progress. And we have been doing a very lousy job at that, I think. So the big corporations, they manage to unite very easily. They manage to overcome their differences, to agree on a program of institutional change that benefits them. And we have done a poor job at bringing up a counter movement that concentrates our political efforts on one reform program. So here are 6 conditions that I think a good reform should fulfill, a good first step of reform should fulfill. First, it should be structural. We have too many one-off programs and policies and initiatives, and they come and go, but ultimately they cannot stem the tide. They are blowing against a huge headwind that comes from our global institutions. We have to take on the task of global institutional reform and make a permanent structural difference in the global institutional architecture. Otherwise, most of our effort will only have short-term effects and will ultimately not make a difference to that inequality spiral that I talked about before. Second, we want a reform that symbolizes very clearly the moral content of it. We want a reform that symbolizes, for example, expresses very clearly the idea that all human lives matter and matter equally. Third, we want a reform that does not initially oppose the united interest of all the rich and powerful agents, but one where we can divide a little bit and have some of these agents on our side, if possible. Fourth, we want a reform that is scalable, where you can start small and then make it bigger, especially in a way that learns from experience, so that you can learn, see how it works, and then adjust it and make it better as you get this experience. Fifth, we want something that empowers our natural allies, namely the poor, because ultimately they should gain a voice. They should be the ones who have more of a say, more of an opportunity to participate in institutional design. And so empowering them, lifting burdens off their shoulders, should be our priority. And finally, we want a reform that is fertile, realistic and also fertile, so that if it works well, it can be a model for other reforms. It can be replicated in other areas. So thinking about these criteria, I came up with this reform, which is the Health Impact Fund proposal, on which I'm now working with a team of people from a number of different disciplines. So medical researchers, economists, lawyers, and so on are helping with this project. The idea is to create a new international agency called the Health Impact Fund. And the Health Impact Fund would establish a permanent new way of incentivizing and rewarding pharmaceutical innovation. So you would be, as a pharmaceutical innovator, you would have the opportunity to register any new medicine, and this new medicine, if you register it, would be rewarded for a period of 10 years. The rewards would come out of annual reward pools of $6 billion initially, where each pool would be divided among registered innovators in proportion to the health impact of their invention. So if in a given year your product had 8% of the health impact of all the registered products, then in that year you get 8% of the reward money. That happens for 10 years, and at the end of 10 years you have your reward and the product goes generic. It can then be produced by anybody. So this is a voluntary system, not because I like it that way, but because we would otherwise have to change the TRIPS agreement. But this voluntary system would have various important advantages. The most important advantage is that all the registered medicines would be cheap from the very beginning. Today, expensive medicines are a very big burden on poor people because poor people simply cannot afford patented medicines. As a condition of registration, you cannot get the usual reward that pharmaceutical innovators get today, which is the reward of being allowed to mark up the product. Today, innovators get a monopoly, and with that monopoly, they can increase the price of their product 40, 50, 100 times over the cost of production. Medicines are cheap to produce. They're very small little things, doesn't cost much to make them, but they sell at a very, very much higher price, and this is because of these monopolies. So the idea of the Health Impact Fund is to give pharmaceutical innovators a second opportunity to be rewarded. They have to choose between the two. You can choose the monopoly, or you can choose the Health Impact Reward. If you choose the Health Impact Reward, your monopoly is gone. You have to put the medicine out for tender. It's produced by the lowest priced manufacturer, and then you buy it from that manufacturer and you sell it at the same price. So you make no money at all on the production or sale of the medicine. You make all your money on the Health Impact Reward. So that's the basic idea. And of course, this is partly in response to the TRIPS agreement, which was part of the WTO treaty, where the whole world now has one uniform intellectual property regime where countries are obliged to give 20-year monopoly patents to pharmaceutical innovators. India has to do that now. India used to be the pharmacy of the world. It used to make many medicines very cheaply. They were sold to Indian consumers in Africa and everywhere. But today, India is obliged to allow pharmaceutical companies to patent their medicines in India for a 20-year monopoly product patent. And so this pharmacy has closed. And we want to reopen it by giving companies this second way of being rewarded. So I think I'll stop here with just one last concluding remark about the Health Impact Fund. The three most important things that it does are, first, as I said, it lowers the price of new medicines dramatically. Secondly, it also attracts pharmaceutical innovators to neglected diseases. Many diseases today that are concentrated among poor people are not researched at all because there's no money to be made. If you have a new medicine for schistosomiasis or malaria, then who is going to buy it at a very high price? Only poor people have these diseases, and so pharmaceutical companies don't research these so-called neglected diseases. So the second advantage of the Health Impact Fund is that it would make neglected diseases very attractive targets for research, because you can make huge amounts of money by developing a new medicine for a disease that many poor people have. It doesn't matter that they are not rich to pay high prices. You sell the medicine to them at a very low price, but you still get rewarded for the health impact that your medicine achieves. The third advantage is that, as you know, there are very severe infrastructure problems in many poor countries. There are not enough doctors, not enough nurses, not enough hospitals, not enough diagnostic equipment, no refrigerators. So for many reasons, the whole healthcare infrastructure is very thin and dilapidated. Now, with the Health Impact Fund system, pharma companies would find that these infrastructure problems are bad for their own finances. If my medicine doesn't reach poor people, then I'm losing money. I get paid for health impact, and if there's no health impact, I don't get paid. So here pharmaceutical companies will be collaborating in the effort to improve health infrastructure in poor countries. They won't do it alone, of course. They will do it with local health ministries and healthcare providers, with international agencies, with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and so on. But still, we want the pharmaceutical companies on the right side of that issue, currently, pharmaceutical companies do nothing to help with these infrastructure problems, because poor people, even though they are irrelevant as customers, are very useful as incubators of disease. So let the poor be sick, that doesn't matter, because if the poor are sick, then rich people who go as tourists into poor countries, they will buy our medicine to protect themselves against the diseases of the poor. So why should we do anything? So the pharmaceutical companies are now incentivized in the wrong way, and the health impact fund system would incentivize them in the right way to help overcome these problems. By the way, I'm not saying all this to criticize the pharma companies. I am very critical of them, but that's not the point here. The point here is that the rules under which the pharma companies have been placed are idiotic rules, totally stupid rules. And so if we can change these rules and reward these companies in a different way, they will act in a different way. They're profit maximizers. They do whatever makes them money, and we just have to make sure it's our responsibility as citizens to make sure that the pharma companies make money doing the right things and don't make money doing the wrong things. Good. Thanks very much.
Muchas gracias, doctor Pogge. Thank you, Mr. Pogge. Carla Huerta, por favor, adelante.
Gracias. Brevemente lo que voy a hacer es unos comentarios sobre el trabajo general del profesor y voy a plantearle en términos generales 2 o 3 preguntas de metodología, no de contenido. I would like to start by sharing with all of you some of the remarks my students, first-year students, law students, made to me a couple of days ago at Yale University, where Professor Pogge spoke recently, 2 days ago actually. They're learning logic and norm analysis. And I asked them, well, how did you like this lecture, that talk? Was it nice? What did you learn from that? And I was really surprised because they told me that you were very well organized in logic, that were coherent work, and that your arguments were always clear and logically explicited. This comes as a surprise. Well, to me, I was very happy to know that they are applying what they're learning with me to analysis of other things. But it was very important because they realized that this kind of discourse on human rights can be a scientific discourse that proposes coherent and reasonable things. So this argument was for them very important, and they learned that you have specific theses that can be examined and evaluated against possible arguments, which you usually do, and you discard the contra-arguments, point out the fallacies, and they really like this approach, like a clear scientific approach to a very important problem, which usually is set on a very discourse that is not really or minimized or used to make political issues on it, like parliamentaries or political people in Mexico. So they were really happy on that formal perspective. Regarding the content, we could notice that Professor Pogge sustains his arguments with empirical evidence, and his theses are consistent with proposals on global justice. His conception is not merely a theoretical construction. He provides criteria to evaluate policies, actions, and institutional design of legal systems rather than a definition. His perspective on justice is not individual, as he has just mentioned. His proposals present from the one-on-one perspective to consider a more general and abstract subject, humanity. The question is not what is justice, but how to do justice, though he offers some criteria to measure these actions taken that have a negative impact in conditions of some groups, the poor and the sick, for example, or nations. The idea of the concept of justice, as philosophy has traditionally tried or attempted to offer, remains like a desiderata. The question would be, is a definition of justice necessary seems not to be the case here, for what you said in the first chapter of your book, or even possible. Professor Pogge adopts a conception of justice as a starting point. This is not a mere modest. This is not a modest approach, but also a more realistic, because he offers reasonable criteria to evaluate the morality of the position and attitude of the affluent countries and corporations towards poverty, for example. The core of his thesis is that human action, that exerted by those who take the decisions with an impact on the necessities and well-being of larger groups of persons, should be moral. And his proposals are founded on this presupposition that people want to act morally, or should intend to act. This implies on one hand that the interest and the action, trade, development, for example, is not merely selfish, but should attempt not only to respect others' rights, but also to keep from doing harm or providing remedies for the harm done. His conception of justice is not reduced to the internal realm of the state's action and capacity to guarantee and provide for the full realization of fundamental rights. The scope is broader, since he offers a perspective that can analyze the most general effect of the decisions of the states and international corporations on the whole world, to evaluate the impact on the actual exercise of fundamental rights that are to be considered as the essence of humanity itself, and is so able to offer a conception of global justice. From this perspective, I could say that there are, or he establishes regarding poverty, some main thesis or main points that are to be enhanced or mentioned is establishing this true nature of human rights that resides not in the liberty itself or the right to do something, but in this connection between the access to the object of the right, and its realization. That's why he, in his books, mentions that human rights can only be fully realized if there is secure access to this object. In that sense, I agree completely. Human rights are not declarations. They are or have to be connected to responsibilities. Regarding responsibilities, some of the legal questions would arise. How can we enforce this responsibility? Who has the right to make a claim? Who would be making the claim for the whole humanity, for a nation, for a group? And to whom? Those would be the most important implementation questions from the legal perspective. Nevertheless, this connection between poverty and under-fulfillment of human rights show us that we can do something, and I think that's another of the theses establishing here. We can do something, it's affordable, it doesn't cost as much as they have usually taught us. Even huge international institutions have told us that it would cost too much, it would be a too big effort to try to solve poverty all around the world. So I think it's a very good starting point to establish this criteria to evaluate justice. The fundamental respect of the person in terms of justice, evaluation of institutions, a new design of legal systems that considers or includes a moral conscience, or even it's not a conscience because institutions don't have a conscience, but moral criteria that could serve as guidelines. And what this has given in of what is perspective of is this new conception of justice that can be called global justice, where we can criticize and maybe change, that would be the final intention, the way these corporations or states act to their own benefit, and change the selfish perspective from this rich agents to include in a way that they can benefit without doing harm, to benefit all the poor that are in extreme situation and that don't see like a possible remedy to the situation. So I think he finally states that there is a general responsibility for poverty, and reading his work and listening to him, I noticed that he always says, we are. It's not all the countries are, the rich are, the corporations are, we are. We all are responsible. And we live in a very poor country, even if the government doesn't say so, which has or reflects the same kinds of proportions he showed us on richness. A very small percentage of our people have all the wealth, and a lot of extreme poverty is ignored and cataloged as simple poverty, which is not as bad, I presume. But I was asking, for example, in the States and Canada, you can ask what the government considers an income of the poor. It's $1,000, more or less. So that's the income of a poor family. Well, what would we do with $1,000? In Mexico, probably a family survives the whole year round with far less than $1,000. So this general responsibility for poverty is avoidable. I think it's one of the most important theses I listened to today. And it's not enough with this positive duty that we have to stop thinking of helping the poor as doing charity. We are not giving away a couple of coins just to feel happy and go on to our vacation somewhere. That we have to consider this more important concept, the negative duty, that is not only not harming, but is doing something to compensate for the harm done. Stopping the harm, but compensate. And in that part I saw that you said, of course, I'm not responsible for the 100-year war. No. I'm not responsible for what they did colonization in Africa. Spanish usually would say, I don't care what happened in Latin America. No, there's no responsibility. But there is other kinds of responsibilities we can assume for what we're doing now in the transactions we are doing with poor countries. No matter what we did before, there's a responsibility as humans towards the others who are suffering or have a different needs. No? Another very important thing is that it's affordable. That's for me very important. It wouldn't cost any of us too much to try to help the others, which would be actually helping ourselves. What I would like to ask you, if you allow me, is something I observed when you made this analogy, because I like very much the way you work, is the harm was done by some groups to certain other groups during a war, etc. So you compare or make this analogy between what we could do for war poverty, for what should have been done regarding the Rwanda genocide. I'm not so sure this analogy is valid, because you're talking a very different situation. Helping poverty or finding a remedy for poverty implies that we take actions altogether, conscious actions, which do no harm. Intervening in Rwanda or any other kind of war situation requires a different kind of participation. It's not it's a war situation, and I'm not so sure that, even if it's horrifying, and I'm sure this applies as well to poverty as to genocide, this objective doesn't make me feel very comfortable for the kinds of lives you're comparing in this analogy. I don't feel very comfortable thinking it's exactly the same. We can do the same to stop the gender genocide. Of course, I criticize very much that we didn't do anything at all. It was terrible just to watch the results and the numbers of dead people increasing by the hour. But what could have been done besides actually more damage, intervening and killing people and killing more people in the moment? No? What can be done would be remedying after, or avoiding actually, which would be the best, that something like that happens. No? Trying to prevent from happening. So maybe that would be one of the questions I have. Of course, I have a lot, but I don't want to abuse the time that was given to me. And especially, I know that the audience has more questions than I have and I like very much your book. It's a very good translation, if I may say so.
Muchas gracias, Carlos. Thank you very much. Would you like to respond first to Carlos' issue, and then we'll go to the questions from the audience?
That's good. I just respond very briefly to a few of these points, which were very good. Thank you. Not working?
Yeah, I just have to kiss the microphone. Okay, so the main thing here is that, of course, we have to distinguish, I think, between moral human rights and legal human rights. And the distinction is clearest when you ask yourself this question. If tomorrow all the governments in the world said that they are no longer committed to human rights, would the human rights then disappear? Of course not. Human rights exist independently of governments, and whether governments recognize them or not, they are there. And so I'm mainly talking in terms of moral human rights. And so your questions, the questions about enforcement and claimants and addressees are very good questions, but they are questions that it is premature to ask. I mean, the idea that we could bring a man like Blair or Bush before an international court and hold them to account for the hundreds of thousands of people they killed, it's just very, very unrealistic at this point. So what I want to do is basically integrate moral human rights into the thinking that goes into the design of international institutions. What I hope to achieve is that when these deals are negotiated, when new treaties are made and so on, that there is some expert testimony there saying, how will this impact human rights? How will, if we go this way or that way, for example, if we institute this new global patent regime, what will happen to poor people? It's a very obvious thing that for poor people there's a problem, because if there are global patents, if everything is patented worldwide, then it will be expensive worldwide, and then poor people don't get access to these important medicines. So mainstreaming is one way to call that we mainstream human rights and make sure that they're at least considered in international negotiations. Two other points about responsibility. One is that you are right that people always say, and I said that myself, things that happened before I was born, I'm not responsible for those things. But there's a second side to that, which is that we are still benefiting in the rich countries from these crimes. So the people of the United States, for example, well, they committed a genocide, they threw out all the native populations and so on, appropriated this whole continent, and now the present generation is saying, well, it wasn't me, I was not involved in that, I was born after this happened. But they reject, so to speak, the bequest of the responsibility, but they do want to have the bequest of the wealth. So they say, well, yes, the wealth, all the richness that comes from the continent, owning this continent, that is mine legitimately. I got that from my parents and my grandparents. But the responsibility, no, that is theirs. So I see that as schizophrenic. You know, if you really reject responsibility, then you should also say it's not right for me to benefit. This is not really my wealth that I'm benefiting from here. This is something that I should give back to the world, and in particular to those who are the victims of past injustice. And again, you have lots and lots of people today who are poor, in part because they live in locations where there have genocides happened, slavery was imposed, and so on. Colonialism was imposed. Africa, for example. So I think that the Africans have a much better claim, poor Africans have a much better claim to this extra wealth that American citizens, U.S. citizens have, than the U.S. citizens, who, insofar as they benefit from historical crimes. And one other thing on responsibility, people often say, you know, whom exactly do you hold responsible? How guilty do you think this person is and that person is? What about poor people in the United States? Are they also guilty? And so on. Again, that's not really my question. My question is, I feel that I myself am responsible, and I write about this topic and then offer that to my compatriots to see, you know, you read this, and if you feel that you are too weak or too dumb or too poor to hold yourself responsible, fine. I'm not going to force you. I can't force you. But think about it yourself and see whether you want to accept a certain responsibility for what is happening. And here I remember the case of the anti-slavery movement, where extremely poor people in Britain were very actively involved in trying to end the slave trade. For example, dock workers in Manchester, very active participants, and even though the livelihoods of their families were at stake, they sacrificed a great deal in order to refuse to unload cotton that came from slave plantations in the US. So final point about Rwanda, I don't think we disagree as much as maybe you think we do, because the point of my essay on Rwanda was really a point about prevention, right? There was a process in place, there was a UN group in place, UNAM, a peacekeeping force, that had been put there after the Arusha Accords, and these Arusha Accords were violated by a movement that was government-sponsored called Interahamwe, and they were collecting weapons in Kigali, the capital, which was against the Arusha Accord. And then the local commander on the ground, Romeo Dallaire, said, we have to confiscate these weapons, and he got instructions from Kofi Annan, no, don't do that. We don't want to get into any messy situation and so on. So Kofi Annan prevented the preventing of the genocide. And I was saying that preventing the preventing of the genocide makes you guilty of, makes you actively responsible for the genocide. If Kofi Annan had just, who of course was acting in behalf of the US, but if he had just allowed Romeo Dallaire to do his job, to do his job, what he was there for, the genocide would not have happened.
Well, it would have been limited.
Yeah, it would have been certainly limited, but probably wouldn't have happened because the Interahamwe, the genocide was conducted with the machetes that were handed out by the Interahamwe. So that was the point of my essay anyway. So it wasn't something where I say that we should, as total outsiders, we should intervene. That, of course, would be a very, very different case. But in this case, we were already on the ground, and the US, through Kofi Annan, was preventing UNAMIR from acting to stop the genocide, or to actually this genocide. I really think could have been prevented if Dallaire had simply confiscated these weapons, because he had a well-trained group of a few thousand men there, and I think could easily have. This was not a militarily serious force, the Interahamwe. So.
Thank you.
We have a bunch of questions. We've taken them in writing, although if someone wants to add anything to the questions, that's fine as well. Can I just read them all to you? That's right. You tell me when you start getting overwhelmed. Okay. So first question. Taking into account, this is Jose Fernando Santillán, Professor Santillán, taking into account your ideas about poverty and justice at the global level, what is your opinion of Amartya Sen's point of view about poverty and justice also at the global level? How do you compare your theories to Amartya Sen's? Another question about, is in Spanish, I'll translate, Marco Ángel Belagaray, who is it? Raise your hand, back there. He's asking about the millennium objectives of the UN, and to what extent have those been effective, and to what extent have they actually been complied with at the global level, and are they useful, these millennium objectives? Another question: who's going to give the rewards? A specific question about your. Why don't we leave that till after this? Keep with the more theoretical questions. Okay, here's a long question by Alejandro Herrera. Do you want to say this yourself? I'll try to read it. It's a long. The importance given to negative duties over positive ones is not only a case. It's not private of the United States. It also exists here in Mexico. 2. Negative duties are also viewed as less important when individuals are less similar to us. 3. What do you think of Peter Singer's proposal that the rich should give a percentage of their profits to the poor? 4. Do you include in structural reforms social and economic justice, and how do you propose it to be realized? More or less?
The last one again?
Do you include... And the last question was, do you include in structural reforms social and economic justice, and how do you propose it to be realized? That was the fourth point here by Professor Herrera. You want to answer those first? We have a few more here.
Yeah, happy to do that. I'm just finding, probably not finding it, but I'll just have to say it. So, start with the first one, the view of Sen. I've just written a review of Amartya Sen's book, The Idea of Justice, and so that has just come out. And basically, I think, to put it very quickly, I would say that we agree on many practical things, and we probably disagree on some theoretical things. So, Sen's main departure from his main contribution to political philosophy is the capability approach. And the capability approach is one that says that we should use social institutions to compensate for natural disparities. So when people have different conversion capacities for converting valuable resources into valuable functioning, then those who have worse conversion capacities should get more resources. He's not consistent with that, unfortunately. So, for example, women tend to live longer than men. And so you would expect the capability approach to say that if women live longer than men should get better medical care so that we equalize between men and women, that they both have the same capability, ability to function. He's not saying that. He's saying that really women should be living 5 years longer than men, and if they're living only 4 years longer than men, then actually medical resources should be spent on women in order to make sure that they get the full 5 years extra. That's something that, again, I have no idea how we can possibly justify that. That's part of the Human Development Index, actually the Gender Development Index that the United Nations Development Program is using. The other thing that really disturbs me about Sen is that he is not very concrete. He gives you the capability approach as a jargon in which you can talk about many different issues, but ultimately he is not very specific about what our most important justice tasks are and what sort of reforms we could undertake to achieve them. Having said that, I'm a huge admirer of his work. He's one of the very, very few people in the world about whom you can teach a whole seminar for a whole semester and never get bored. It's a lot of good stuff. And so I've read almost everything he's written. I've learned an enormous amount from him. And I'm also happy to say that he is on the advisory board of the Health Impact Fund. So he's one of the people, the patron saints of that fund. And so we have much more in common than divides us. About the MDGs, that is one research area of mine. I've written a lot of stuff about the MDGs.
Millennium Development Goals.
Sorry. Millennium Development Goals. What do they call it in Spanish?
Objetivos del Milenio.
So this is, I'm sorry to say, this is one of the greatest frauds that has ever been perpetrated. And basically, I give you only the first Millennium Development Goal, the most important. Halving poverty by 2015. That's the goal. We will halve poverty by 2015. Now, the first time that was promised was at the World Food Summit in Rome, 1996. And there they said we will halve the number of extremely poor people, hungry people, by 2015. Then in the year 2000, there was the Millennium Declaration, where they said we will halve the percentage of poor people between 2000 and 2015. Now the percentage is a ratio, right? You have the number of poor divided by the number of people in the world. Because the number of people in the world is growing, you don't have to do so much at the top. So if the number of poor people is growing 20% to 120% of what it was, then the number of poor has to fall to only 60% of what it was, and you have halved the percentage. So this was the first fraud. But then after the Millennium Declaration, the declaration was reformulated as the Millennium Development Goals. And there they made two more changes. They said, no, the baseline is not the year 2000, but the year 1990. So all the good work that the Chinese had done reducing poverty will be counted towards the goal. And they also said that we are now using the proportion of poor people in the population of the developing countries, which is faster growing. So the population of the developing countries grows 46% between 1990 and 2015, so to 146% of what it was. And so the number of poor has to be reduced to 73% of what it was in order to halve world poverty. That's what they're now doing. They want to reduce the number of poor people between 1990 and 2015 by 27%. They still call that halving poverty, but it's not exactly halving poverty. Anyway, with these two cosmetic changes, they have added 500 million people to the number of those whose extreme poverty in 2015 will be morally acceptable. So instead of 828 million extremely poor people, we are now aiming for 1,324 million extremely poor people. And we will achieve that through the cosmetics, right? It's a cosmetic achievement. And what does it mean? 500 million extra extremely poor people. That means concretely 6 million extra deaths every year after 2015. So this is a huge crime that was committed here in the United Nations under presumably US influence to lift the target, to make the target less ambitious twice, until finally the target is so unambitious that it's almost fulfilled automatically just through ordinary economic growth. So, and of course, the amazing thing is that people who commit this crime, who add millions of deaths to the world, are people who also get celebrated for being the people who are pursuing the Millennium Development Goals and so on. It's just amazing. When this happened, the cheating with the Millennium Development Goals, I went to all the major newspapers, tried to get it published, and I got one newspaper interested in Germany, but all the others said, no, our readers are not interested in this topic. Anyway, then the last set of questions, what do I think about the Singer Initiative? I think the Singer Initiative is a very good initiative. I would see these contributions that rich people make not as gifts or assistance. I would see them as compensation, but that doesn't matter. What matters is that it happens. So let me say two other things. I mean, Singer is doing this thing with billionaires and so on. We have two things in progress now. One is a website called Giving What We Can, and there people promise to give 10% of their future earnings for the rest of their life. I'm a member of that, and that's sitting in Oxford. I was also one of the people organizing that. And so we hope that we get pretty large amounts of money together. They also have a very good research department which looks for the most effective ways to spend the money. And then a brand new thing that we just started in the last few months is a project where university presidents will pledge 5% of their income for poverty eradication in the poor countries. And so we want to get 20 US university presidents to begin that pledge. And I've just talked with the ones I know. I know only 3. Dartmouth, University of Pennsylvania, and Georgetown. And of course my own president I don't think there's much hope. But anyway, we'll see. So we're working on that, and as soon as we have 20 presidents together, we will make that a big initiative and invite many other university presidents to join. And then the last question, I wasn't very clear what it was about social and economic justice. Of course that is structural. Of course that is something that we want to build in. So the way I present it is that the way we structure the economy has effects on the distribution of income and wealth and education and access to medical care and so on. And we should structure the institutions in light of their impact on what really matters, namely how people live. And so, of course, there are social and economic rights, and we should try to fulfill them by adjusting institutions at the global and national level in such a way that we achieve these social and economic objectives, and in particular fulfill these social and economic rights.
Can I take another round? Tom has given, this is your 6th talk this week? 6th, maybe? Yeah. 4th or 5th. He has still another one this afternoon, so we don't want to tire him out too much, but... That's right. Okay, so first question from our colleague Isa Luna, professor also here at the Institute of the University. She asked, how can information held in the government and international institutions empower the poor? Transparency, access to information. Why is this not in many indexes or analysis of empowerment in the literature, just access to information? I'm going to go ahead and read some other questions as well. There's some larger questions about I'll go ahead and bring them together. A question about those, in Spanish, those who do not belong to the elite, how can they have an influence, direct influence in changing the rules? Because poverty is also something that excludes them from politics itself, and so how can they play a role in bringing about these kinds of changes which benefit them? Related question about indigenous organizations. What do you think could or should, this is Augusta Dwyer, we met earlier, what do you think could or should be the role of indigenous organizations of the poor in the reform you described, and should international institutions pay more attention to them? Related question about indigenous communities, sort of a side issue, but I'll read it. What do you think about the indigenous communities between Mexico and the United States? There's a mention here of the Papagos. Who is it? Isaac Cárdenas? And the positive response of the American government to the needs of these people.
Yeah, which people exactly?
Is it a particular indigenous community you're talking about? Papagos. Okay. And the United States is indigenous communities on both sides of the border, apparently. Right.
They're migrating people.
Attention to them. Okay. Gracias. Another question: how can we make it attractive for the richest, this new kind of business, when they may not accept less profitability than today, regardless of the fact that the new business style is harmful or not harmful? In the end, it's going to imply less profits, and how can we make it work even though that's the case? Finally, a specific question about who's going to give the rewards. Is it the government of the benefited country, or is it the international organization, the International Health Organization, IHO, or how is specifically this going to work there? I'm going to put my 2 cents in here too, just quickly. It seems to me, Professor Pogge, that you are particularly speaking to the audience in the United States, which makes sense. Your students, corporations, governments, and it's sort of bouncing off one of the earlier questions here in this group as well. What could be or should be the message to the poor of Mexico, right? Should we be looking to conquest government power through politics? So that, it's the only way we can actually influence this kind of international structure through our government. We need to focus our attention on getting a president who will defend the poor in the international arena, or is it a better use of our energy to organize internationally, grassroots international organizations to pressure directly towards these international structures? In terms of political strategy, what would be the most effective for the poor and the privileged in Mexico, to particularly your proposal, or more general?
It's a wonderful question. So on the first one, I think on information, I think that's a very good idea, and of course it's something that has happened in many developing countries, that poor people or opposition people in general have gained access to this information. And transparency is also I mentioned briefly that we have this conference coming up next week where John's mother is actually going to be, where transparency is a very major issue with regard to finance as well. So in many poor countries, for example, the government will sell the resources of the country, And nobody will know. There's no information at all about how much money the government is getting paid. And so there's no way of knowing how the money is being spent, no way of having any kind of accountability or transparency or something like that. And so yes, this is a very, very important issue that would empower the poor and would enable them then to hold their government to account and at least understand how they are being exploited and shortchanged. And a whole bunch of questions dealing with the influence by those who are not belonging to the elite and so on. So I do this a little bit out of order perhaps, but the main thing is it's true that my writing is addressed to audiences in the developing countries for the most part, but also to elite audiences in the poorer countries, because I think increasingly with globalization, it's not so much the rich countries dominating the poor countries, it's more and more an international elite, a kind of global elite of rich people and corporations dominating the rest of the world. And so I feel I speak to them mainly, and I do that because that's what my comparative advantage is. Right? I would not be a credible person speaking for the Zapatistas, for example, or something. It's not just language skills, is also where I come from, what I understand and so on. I try to fix the problem or help fix the problem among these elites by maybe undermining their ideology, undermining their self-confidence that they often have, and much of the brainwashing that goes on in elite institutions such as Yale. So, and other people obviously have other roles, other things that they are much more suitable for, and that I could not do. So I see that as a kind of division of labor. Now, what people can do, I think they can do tremendous things, and you can see from looking both into other countries and looking at the history, you can see what very, very poor and marginalized people have successfully done. So look at Gandhi's movement in India, for example, protest against the tax on salt. Tremendously effective and successful social movement by people who were much poorer even than I think most Mexicans today would be. Or look at the dock workers in Manchester that I mentioned earlier, who said we will not have any part in slavery. This has nothing to do with us particularly, we are not slaves, but we will not collaborate, we will not cooperate, we want slavery to end. And it was an incredibly unlikely movement that ended slavery, and it succeeded anyway. Britain, much against the will of the elite, and with great economic losses to them, the slave trade was incredibly profitable. Britain not only ceased being a slave trader, but it even challenged the slave trade everywhere. They didn't want anybody else to trade slaves anymore, and so they took the right to challenge ships on the open seas and to confiscate them if they were transporting slaves. So quite a remarkable historical precedent. So I think there are things that poor people can do, and quite a number of things, not maybe as individuals, but they have to organize and have to think together about what might be the most effective strategies and so on. And I certainly couldn't tell you what specific things poor Mexicans could do in this present situation. Mobilizing politically is certainly important. Getting a president and other politicians in Mexico elected who would be champions of the poor, who would take seriously the moral obligation to improve education, healthcare, and finance and social security for poor people is obviously important, but it's also important, I think, to connect with social movements in other countries, if only to learn from them, because there are lots of innovative things that people have done in other countries, in South Africa, in Brazil, in India, to improve the situation of the poor, and you can probably learn a great deal from these movements for the Mexican case. Now, indigenous organizations, I don't know anything about the Papagos, so I'm sorry I can't comment on that particular issue, but in general I can say this, that obviously indigenous cultures are under enormous threat. Not just economically, but also their whole culture, their way of life is under continuous threat. And especially in those cases where they are unlucky enough to have anything valuable nearby that people may want to exploit. You know, if you're sitting near minerals or something, or near something that is suitable for tourism, or if you have any kind of plants in your area that might be useful for making pharmaceuticals or anything of that sort, outsiders will come in and they will try to destroy your community. They will buy up parts of the land. They will try to co-opt some of the people. They will bring in outsiders who will come to live there, and so on and so forth. And they will cut down the forests. They will open up the earth in order to extract the minerals and the oil and so forth, create pollution, enormous pollution in the process. So all of that is true, and so these indigenous communities should be protected, and it's very, very difficult to protect them because often they are relatively small and don't have much of a political chance of political influence. The one case where I've been involved is the case of getting some benefit sharing. There were cases where plants that were used indigenously for many, many centuries were then exploited by some corporation that patented a product based on them. So the Hoodia plant in South Africa is one example, which is patented, is sold as an appetite suppressant and sort of an endurance drug, and the San people, the so-called Bushmen, who were cultivating that plant for many, many generations, got nothing of the benefit. And so there's now this convention on biodiversity where indigenous communities get a little bit of the benefit. But I must say my heart is divided about that. It's good that they get some of the benefit, but it also is something that is against the values of these communities, because these communities, if you ask them, they say, we are perfectly happy to share this. It's wonderful that we have a plant that we discovered and cultivated that works for something, that is good for humanity, and the idea that we want to be paid for this is really alien to us. We don't really want to be paid for that. But on the other hand, we don't want to pay, it's strange that you ask us to pay for your products, And so given that we have to pay for all of your stuff, maybe I suppose it is a good idea that we get something for our stuff. But it's under existing patent regimes, it's very, very difficult to get indigenous communities to get a fair share of the large benefits that corporations are getting from basically their knowledge, their knowledge, and also their husbandry, the cultivation of these plants and so on. Good. And then finally about the Health Impact Fund, the rewards would come mainly from governments, and the reason for that is that we want the pools to be firmly predictable 20 years into the future. So if a company starts a research project today, it will take maybe 8 years until there is a medicine that is marketable, and then it takes another 10 years for the medicine to be fully rewarded. And so a company will undertake a research project for a neglected disease, for example, only if they know that there will be money in the late 2020s when they start today. And only governments can make these long-term guarantees. So this is supposed to be the model of a global public good, where all the governments in the world put money in, even the poor countries. Everybody puts money in proportion to their gross national income, and everybody gets the benefit because the medicines on the Health Impact Fund are all going to be very cheap. So everybody contributes, everybody benefits. It's a real public good. Now, how can we get pharma companies to participate? Was another question. And here we have two questions. One is, will they support the Health Impact Fund's birth? Will they allow the Health Impact Fund to exist? And in two ways it's good for them, and one way it's bad for them. It's good for them because there's extra money. So in addition to researching hair loss and researching diabetes, they can now research schistosomiasis and dengue fever and malaria. And they get some extra money. Not a lot, but some extra money. So that's good. Secondly, it's good for their image. The pharma companies have a very bad image, and if they could do some research on neglected diseases, do more for the poor and get paid for it, that would be nice. And it would also help with project introduction. So if, for example, a company like Johnson & Johnson invents a nice drug against schistosomiasis, then maybe people in developing countries are more likely to buy their baby oil or something else, baby powder, whatever. So in all these ways it's a positive thing, but there's one negative. The negative is that if we have a new health impact fund registered drug in a class of a therapeutic class for a disease where other drugs already exist and are patented, then the patented drugs lose their market. So it could be that in diabetes, for example, you now have 6 very expensive drugs, and then imagine there's a new drug that comes in that is health impact fund registered and very cheap. That drug would take away the whole market. And so pharmaceutical companies are worried that the health impact fund will undermine their patented products. So I always say with a big smile, it's voluntary. You don't have to register your product. But even if it's voluntary, somebody else might register and take away my profit on my high-priced patented medicine. So that's what pharma companies are worried about. In the moment, no pharma company is against the idea, and some are cautiously supportive. So Pfizer is sort of not so friendly, Glaxo is very friendly, Merck and Sanofi are in between, and so on. I talk with these guys a lot. And there's one other interesting fact, that there's a lot of heterogeneity in the companies. These companies are not monoliths, so they have some people in the company who hate the idea and some people in the company who love the idea. And those who love the idea are mostly the researchers, because they became researchers because they wanted to make an important contribution. And then they are told by the company, study hair loss. And so they're very disappointed. They wanted to get maybe a Nobel Prize for finding a drug against malaria, and now they're doing hair loss. Nobody's going to get a Nobel Prize for hair loss, right? It's not going to happen. So, maybe. But anyway, that's the story. I think we can get it done. In the moment, it's a bad time with the global financial crisis, but we have strong political support in India and in China and in South Africa and in my own country, Germany. So the second most important party in Germany, the second biggest, called the Social Democratic Party, has officially made the Health Impact Fund part of their platform. And not only that, they are paying me money to organize a big conference in Brussels at the EU headquarters to publicize it. So and they have, of course, many sister parties in other European countries in the EU, other social democratic and labor parties. So I think if I work very, very hard, maybe we can pull it off. And if we pull it off, I think it would be the first step to something much, much bigger, where we say innovation should never be rewarded by monopolies. It should always be rewarded by results. So the same thing with agriculture. If you have a nice new seed, you should not be rewarded for it by selling it at a higher price. You should be rewarded by the reduction of fertilizer use, the reduction of pesticide, the increase in nutrient yield, and so on. If you have a new green technology that allows to reduce pollution, you should not be rewarded with a monopoly where you can charge a high price. We want this to be used. So the price should be low, and your reward should be on the basis of how much pollution you are avoiding. So this is an idea that starts small with health, but it can become much bigger in the health area, and it also can be used in other areas as well. So ultimately, this is supposed to be the beginning of a major change in the global institutional architecture that makes it much more poor-friendly, and also makes it more efficient and reduces pollution and burdens on future generations.
Thank you very much, Thomas Pogge. It's a pleasure to have you here. I don't think I have to run out to the airport or anything at this point. Creo que se queda un poquito si alguien quiere acercarse a conversar con él. Es una persona muy abierta, muy amena. Vamos a cerrar el evento en este momento, pero estamos aquí conversando un poquito más y les pido por favor pues un fuerte aplauso para el Dr. Pogge. Les invito otra vez su libro. Este se va a presentar hoy en la noche a las 7 en el Fondo de Cultura Económica por la Condesa, ¿no? Sí. Es la de la Condesa, ¿no? Sí. Y ahí lo pueden. Esto no está a la venta aquí, pero en la tarde sí está a la venta y son de lectura obligada. Muchas gracias a ustedes. Una cosa, sus constancias, algunos nombres no se podían leer bien, entonces hay una lista por ahí, Iván. ¿Dónde está la lista? Aquí afuera. Nada más que revisen sus nombres, porque los que tienen una estrellita no lograron distinguir bien sus nombres para que salga bien la constancia. Gracias.